Hello and welcome. The Purdue Institute for the Study of the Iranian World welcomes you to another episode of our podcast, Legacies of Ancient Persia. Join us as we further explore the many legacies of ancient Persia and its relevance to global patrimony. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Legacies of Ancient Persia. This week, our guest is Marco Ferrario, an ancient historian specializing in the longue durée of the Eastern Iranian world. In this episode, we discuss how influential mentors and serendipitous opportunities pushed his interests from classics into studying ancient Persia and Central Asia, Bactria's rich history and the challenges of studying the region, and the importance of interdisciplinary research to gain a more holistic appreciation of antiquity. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you like what you hear, please give our show a 5-star rating and review us on Apple or Spotify. Well, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast, and I'd like to start you off with what I hope is a pretty easy question and ask you, when did you discover that you really had a passion for studying the ancient world?
Well, I would say it was pretty early on. If I didn't know already, it definitely started the very first semester of my undergraduate studies, because I took a very exciting class in Greek history. And after the first class, I said to myself, okay, that's it. I'm going to write my bachelor paper, say, on ancient Greece, something related to ancient Greece. I didn't know exactly what, but I already had some ideas. I was interested in the archaic Greek world and the Eastern Mediterranean. So it was very early on. That's where I met Herodotus, of course, and from there it was no turning back. So that's how it began.
That's great. And so you met Herodotus, as many people do, and you go, oh, this is so wonderful. Were you ever dissuaded, and did you ever think about maybe doing something else, or was that kind of just, no, I found it and I love it?
No, I thought I just found it because I had a very good teacher. That's often how it is about, that hey, he did that. He was a specialist. He is a specialist in Herodotus, and he had a very fascinating historical approach. So not just philology, although he's a very skilled philologist too, but he was interested in the historical background. So combining what to my mind then, and I think they still are, quite innovative ways of reading the text through social anthropology, for example. And then, yes, I think I said this is the guy, and that's how it began. In a way, never left, because Herodotus is still a very compelling author to engage with for me. Also because, as you and many people in the audience know, it has so many wild stories that you can address from many different standpoints. So that was it. No, I would say that was it.
That's awesome. And obviously, not only does he have many stories, he wrote about many places, definitely not just Greece. And so, did this inspire you at all to go outside, or at the time, did you want to focus on just within Greece, or, walk us through your process?
I have to say, I think I never really wanted to stay in Greece. I think it's a shame to admit for somebody trained in classics that I have not visited Greece yet. But because I think had I not done ancient history, I would have done, I don't know, Islamic studies or something like that, because I was interested in the East, whatever that means. And so I had already this idea of engaging with the Eastern Mediterranean world at any rate. And that's slowly, the Persian Empire dawned, because how much of what Herodotus has to say about Persia and all the wild stories that he has about the kings, my professor was very into the Cyrus logos, so the story around Cyrus and how the empire came into being. And this is how I got interested into the Persian Empire. And so let's say I think you can see a move, let's say, from Herodotus then farther away from his world in space and in time until I landed more squarely into the Persian Empire and especially into Central Asia for reasons that we may address then later.
Yeah. And so I'm curious, since you didn't really want to stay in Greece, I'm just wondering whether you came up against the same issue that many people here in the States do, which is having schools not have programs in Iranian studies or the ancient Near East. And so did you end up in classics basically kind of by default, where there just wasn't another option?
Yes, yes, in a way, yes. I mean, I did my training in Italy, and in Italy there are basically two big universities that engage with the ancient Near East. They are in Naples, in the south, and in Venice. But the core business in there also is either Assyria. I mean, Naples has a very good course in Elamite, but I didn't know it at the time. And so I ended in classics by default and by ignorance, also because for some reason I was in a rush to get into my university, without really sitting a little bit and looking around what the landscape looked like. And so, yes, I had to go back to what I was interested into from a quite difficult position, also because of the training. If you just think the languages that you are supposed to know, okay, at some point I learned the Byzantine inscription by heart. So at some point you get into Old Persian just because it's the most famous one, but I lacked a proper training in Iranian studies, or broadly speaking, ancient Near Eastern history, which it's a problem that I'm still trying to figure out. So I'm trying to bridge the gap somehow.
Yeah, well, no, I totally sympathize because it is an issue for everyone who has ever been interested in the Persians or, well, anything remotely in the ancient Mediterranean outside of Greece. It really isn't easy for us. So sympathize. Walk us through the process. So since you really did kind of want to always move east, what was the process like and how did you get from Greece in the bachelor's over to basically Central Asia now? Can you walk us through that?
Yes, I mean it's as I think as it happens mostly it was a mix, of opportunities and so circumstances and sheer chance because I was on the lookout for a master degree project and I had something vaguely in mind related to ideas of kingship moving from the ancient Near East towards the later periods, but I couldn't find a match sort of with my supervisor. Then at some point, I got interested into Megasthenes, so this Seleucid ambassador, going through India, but we had a problem with finding an Indologist. And then at some point, he mentioned that had always been interested in Bactria, not bacteria, as the phone always corrects me when I try to type it in, Bactria. And I said, okay, let's do that, because it seemed that he was in a rush to find this topic. And so that's how I started. And I started digging into it a little bit just to have a sense of the bibliography, because I had an idea of where the place more or less was. Because in the introduction to Greek history, at some point you get to Alexander, that Alexander went over there. Maybe you had the bad luck of watching the Oliver Stone movie, so you remember Rosario Dawson playing as Roxane, so you have a sheer idea of where Bactria is, but I didn't know much. And then a gigantic Pandora box opened because I realized how much stuff there was. And I started out from there, and it happened. At the time I was in Innsbruck in Austria doing an exchange program, and while looking for stuff on academia, I literally stumbled upon a conference program in Berlin where all the big names were. And so I just went there, and that's how I started getting networked somehow with the field of Central Asianists. And once there, I never came back because I found the whole topic so fascinating. Um, but also, I just to kind of bring it full circle from where I am now, so more on the Achaemenid period, is that in Innsbruck I had another great mentor, who is a dean of Achaemenid studies, which his name is Robert Trollinger, and through him I clearly got an understanding that so often, also because of the sources, but people think that Central Asia opened to history basically with Alexander, and that's not the case because there was a huge empire which ruled over there 200 years before that, and to understand many things that happened afterwards, you have to get a sense of the history before. And I got so interested into that history that I decided to write a PhD dissertation on, and that's where I am now.
That's a fascinating path and full of such interesting things because I think, well, for me at least, and I am a classicist, I'm not a general public member, but when you say Bactria, the only thing, and it's really unfortunate, the only thing that really pops into my brain is, I mean, Greco-Bactria has a interesting history, but all I know is really sort of after it's been Hellenized. So if you were to ask me, what was happening there before, I think my answer would just be big question mark. So since this is what you're interested in, can you tell us and anyone else who's very interested, what was in Bactria before Alexander?
Well, that's a very complicated issue because yes, I mean the short, easy answer would be there was the Persian Empire, but then that brings more questions to the front to the fore. How did it establish himself? How was the country ruled? Who were the people living in there? And that's something that I myself am trying to understand more. We have some better ideas in the last we have gotten some better ideas since the last 20 years that research has been done on the topic, but still there are so many open questions. I mean, I would say it is important to understand first and foremost that there was at least since the Bronze Age a hugely complex and hugely sophisticated indigenous civilization called BMAC, which is a shortcut for Bactria Margiana archaeological culture, with Bactria and Margiana being the two big satrapies of the empire, located more or less between Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan in modern Central Asia. But this civilization had contacts farther towards the steppes around the Aral Sea, beyond in Sogdiana, so around the region of Samarkand, and probably farther away. And this, we are talking about the Bronze Age, so a good millennium and a half before, or even 2 millennia and a half before the Persians came, and how the transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, so right before, say, a millennium before the Persians came into be, and how it affected settlement patterns, for example, or just the constituency of the people. The big question between settled, so farmers and nomads, because in that area, we have a big oasis with settled cultures, some quite big settlements with temples, most likely, or even palaces, and farther away, more scattered settlements of pastoralists. How all this interacted, it's very difficult to figure, but it is definitely something that left a mark on the place before the Persians came. And even though now we know for a fact, thanks to the archives from Persepolis, that the empire very swiftly and very quickly organized the region according to templates that we know already from the Persian heartland, it is impossible not to, I mean, it would be foolish, I think, not to imagine that these patterns had to adapt to local conditions and to interact, with local power holders who had already a very sophisticated culture. This is important, not to imagine the empire as, most people still do. Also, when they think, of empire, they think of the Roman Empire, and the idea that they have of the Roman Empire is that something that goes, like Caesar says, saw conquered and stayed, But that was definitely not the case, and it's important to keep in mind that this by itself incredibly fascinating indigenous environment, to think how the empire actually worked on the ground and how this administrative pattern of rule came into be. For example, the scribes. You have to imagine how did they learn the language in which the administrations was run. It would be difficult to imagine that they were brought wholesale from Persia. There must have been, we know it from later periods from the Greeks, that there were local people, or at least people with indigenous names, writing in Greek. And I would contend that something like that must have happened at least at the beginning of the empire history. And that brings, of course, a whole set of questions about how this actually played out on the ground. Also because it's such a huge territory, so different in landscape, which already brings different affordances to different people who interact with that. So that would be a first question. There were the Persians before the Greeks, but these Persians had to interact with many different constituencies over different landscapes, and with a huge heritage, which oftentimes goes just swept away in textbooks, because this is the matter of archaeologists working on the Bronze Age, and they deal with that. But it's the same place. It's the same place. And if you think of just the stories that might have circulated about those inheritance, if you think about just more probably for a more familiar parallel, if you think about the stuff that Homer tells in the Iliad about Troy, which was the staple of Greek social memory, in a way, you may think that maybe in Bactria there were stories. We don't have a Homer Bactrian, Bactrian Homer, but we know that this civilization exists, and I would contend that it left a mark in the social memory of the place before the Persians. And so you have already to start thinking how this interacted as they tried to establish their presence on the spot.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, obviously, Bactria has a very long history. Now, just as you were speaking, I was also realizing, and I suppose this is going to depend a lot on the time period, but just pick any time period, but roughly something that maybe some people would be more likely to be familiar with. But yeah, can you locate Bactria for us on a map? Where is it? What would it be today? Kind of how far was it to, the center of ancient Persia itself, which is today Iran?
Yes, it was quite far, also taking into account the constraints of mobility at the time. But so the Persian satrapy, so the kind of administrative region, as best as we can locate it, was probably centered around Balkh, ancient Balkh, which is close to the modern town of Mazar-e-Sharif in northern Afghanistan. So not Kabul, that was most likely another province, but to the northwest of Kabul. So the north of the country, there is Mazar-e-Sharif, and that most likely Balkh was around there. And it extended to quite a significant stretch north of the Hindu Kush mountains, and let's say encompassing pieces of what today is southern Uzbekistan, so just right to the north, beyond the Amudarya River, which the Greeks knew as the Oxus, and then farther east into what today is Tajikistan. And it is a contested question how far north from that, because farther north there was another satrapy called Sogdiana, and the borders of the two are quite difficult to locate. But there has been studies on historical geography based, of course, on the Greek text, mostly because they provide a lengthier narrative, and they name more places that claims that actually Bactria extended more to the north than what has been usually assumed. So around the mid, let's say, of modern Uzbekistan. So it was quite a big territory scattered through different landscapes, because you have the oases, you have steppe deserts, you have the mountain ranges. And if you look at the map, you look Afghanistan from central Iran, so where Persepolis is. It's a good stretch, and comparable. I mean, in a way, just to get a sense, comparable from the same distance from Persepolis to the to Anatolia, to the Mediterranean, through quite a similar challenging landscape. So it was not easy to rule.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for setting the stage, just for those of us who need sort of a modern map to help envision the territory. Something I think that I've always wanted to ask someone who studies Bactria, because I don't know many people, so this is perfect. What would you say is the most notable? I don't like, I hate trying to label it, but like the most notable thing to come from the region, to come from Bactria, or something that was developed there in antiquity, that, we have that region to thank for.
Well, I mean, that's difficult. That's difficult to say. We have, again, if you take into account already the Bronze Age, which I think you should, there is an amazing, incredible material culture. The mosaics, like the one they found in the Greek Bronze Age, sometimes with even kind of comparable themes, that just weird animals fighting against each other, the glyptics, for example. So it's just some vessels of different materials, which then you find also later in the Persian period, of course, somehow influenced by the courtly environment, sort of the kind of style that you see already from Persepolis, but probably made locally. So they were very skilled artisans, and let's say perhaps on a less say flashy way, but in a way more interesting, they were extremely skilled engineers. So when in the 70s, when archaeologists, the French archaeologists, started studying the region, because they found the decade before, the Afghan king was going on a hunt, and he found a Greek capital, like a Corinthian capital, popping out from the ground. And the French had a monopoly on the excavation on there, and they started digging, and they found a sort of Afghan Pompeii known as Zayhanum, which is the Uzbek word for moon lady, which is the modern name of the town. We don't know how it is called, and it is today what has left. It's in eastern Afghanistan. So when the archaeologists started digging around the region to get a sense also of the landscape in which this town was located, they were confronted with incredibly sophisticated canals for irrigation, which is perhaps one of the most notable aspects of the region. So if I had to pick an answer for your question, it would be the irrigation system, because it was definitely an indigenous skill which stretched back since the Bronze Age, because this prospection, I've been able to establish how far back in time these canals reached, and they were able to fascinate and to impress engineers from the 20th century, that they could not figure how people with that level of technology could have done something like that, because they thought they might not have been able themselves to replicate this irrigation system with the technology they had available. And this kind of skill, of course, is something that the empire must have coveted, and we know it from the Persepolis tablets, for example, because there are hints of Bactrians being shipped all over the empire, probably to do irrigational work, because they were so good at it. So I would say that it's a fascinating aspect that people maybe don't think of, because we are used to think of, flashy material culture, for example, of great men. We don't know kind of a Bactrian equivalent of Cyrus the Great or Alexander, but they were very skilled artisans, which is something that deserves mention, I think.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a underthought about category. So I'm very happy that you brought that up. Now, you did mention great men, and there were many during the Achaemenid Empire. And so I'm curious, did any of the great Persian kings either have a place, a palace or something that they went there? Was it not a place that they went to because it was so far? Essentially, did any notable king or multiple kings kind of go there and do something in the region?
Again, direct evidence is hard to find. We have hints in the Greek texts that Cyrus II's son, Bardia, might have had a tenure of some kind in the east. I mean, the east, of course, is not to say much because it's a huge place. But if one has in mind the importance of the region, like the big challenger of Alexander, Bessos, came from there, was the satrap of Bactria. And so if a man of that importance was already in there, it's likely that the kings frequented the place and they must have had a palace, as the Seleucids did, and as the Greco-Bactrians, then later so-called Greco-Bactrians had. So I would definitely say yes. Then I mean, Cyrus himself died somewhere in the steppes north of it, which makes one think that he had business to run in the region, probably already after he conquered it and had established a foothold in the empire. And again, from the Greek texts, we know that what they call the second after the king, so kind of a cadet son, was stationed in Bactria because it was such an important place. And then again, if you think that Seleucus, after he became king in Babylon, he campaigned in the east, and he took with him his wife, who came from the region. You definitely start getting a sense, that was at some extent a royal place to be. And in the case of the Persians, given how good they connected the empire with the road system, for example, Bactria was a place difficult to reach, but I mean, it took you long time, but it was definitely not far away. I think it's important that people don't think of this place as just something far off, and start romanticize it as a kind of faraway graveyard of empire. That was something very tightly connected into the imperial system and in the understanding of people. Because Herodotus, again, to come back to our friend, Herodotus had a very good sense that you could take people from Libya and send them all over to Bactria, meaning, without them starving, of course. That was possible to move in reasonable time those distances. So it was something that it was definitely in the purview of the empire and of the king. So we know that they traveled a lot, and I would definitely contend, even though we don't have direct evidence yet, but you can pierce together from indirect sources that they or some of their representatives, they must have visited the region often.
Yeah, I was just curious only because I was trying to rack my brain to remember, why did I feel something incredible happen? And then it hit me. The 2004 Oliver Stone Alexander film, I believe, it's one of the only media things that actually shows Bactria, which I guess is good, question mark. But also, obviously, it is not known for being very accurate. But I believe that in the film they portrayed as the spot where Darius III is supposed to be dying. So that's clearly not a
Yes.
thing. So that's why I asked, because I was like, so if that didn't happen, I was just curious if something else did. Yeah, I guess just like, why, in your opinion, do you think they would have had portrayed Darius III dying there and not somewhere else?
Well, I mean, because it's very difficult. It's very difficult to pinpoint exactly where Darius died, even though we have good reason to think that he was farther to the west of Bactria. But I mean, I think you should ask, somebody should ask Oliver Stone. I kind of feel that partly was because of they had to transition quickly toward the main issue, which was the wedding with Roxane, which actually took place somewhere in Bactria. and that was the topic of it. And so who knows, maybe they were short of landscapes or scenarios or money. They just quickly transitioned to that. But the big thing that sticks in mind of people when they think about Bactria, besides the Greco-Bactrian Empire, if they ever heard of it, is actually the marriage with Roxane, and that's also what in the movie is made a big deal of, which to me is interesting on many levels. I mean, of course, there is all the Orientalizing trope that people have already talked about very very often. Which is ridiculous in many respects, because I mean, this, as I said, these were people with a huge, let's say, with a huge memory of who they themselves were. They had been schooled and these were royalties. Roxana was royalty, not as high as Darius' mother, for example, but she was royalty. And to portray her the way they do, it makes no sense whatsoever. And here's the meaning to everybody involved. But it was a big thing because and it's interesting to me to that episode, because there it is somehow portrayed as something in between, the great blonde white conqueror pacifying the region, but also at the same time, finding an agreement and a compromise, to live with the locals in a different way, just than to slaughter them around, which I suppose it's an improvement. But you could, what is interesting to me is that you could read that episode, as a way of the locals to, let's say, domesticating the conqueror, because the wedding took place in Bactria in a local residence. If we believe the sources, it took place in the residence of somebody of them, according to customs that they somehow directed. And Alexander and all the other Macedonians stood by and saw this happening, and they were directed, in how to do these things, which already brings up interesting questions about the interpreters, who brokered the thing. And if we look at kind of similar episodes from different times and places in world history, we know that these kind of ceremonies, are more nuanced than it seems. And even though apparently, allegedly there is a big empire, powerful, brokering the deal, actually the alleged subjects may have more agency in these processes than what we may think. So that's an interesting episode to think through, because it gives you can look at it more than just, the white man's burden from Greece of ruling the East, was Afghanistan. So with everything that brings to mind to especially Western audience. But, if you look at it, let's say, against the grain, then you start thinking differently about these people and also how skilled they were in the language of imperial diplomacy, because they had 200 years to get acquainted with that, thanks to the Persians.
I'm curious because as you were talking, it's making me realize there's so much there that people could do with. There's just material that you could do with. You could make an actually interesting story. You wouldn't have to have a weird, inaccurate episode. So, as someone who does study Central Asia and does it not from sort of the Asian perspective, let's say, who's doing it more from the Persian side, why do you think that it's not as popular
Mm-hmm.
kind of an area to study as some of the other things? Is it because I mean, it's hard you can't really go to Iran now. So you would think, okay, so you got to pivot to something else. And, well, maybe with the exception of Afghanistan, let's say, not maybe a great place to go now, but some of the other places, though, you can travel to. So
Yes.
I would find that it would be easier since you have access to those countries. And I don't know what's there, and I don't know whether it would be hard. So I'm hoping that maybe you can tell us a little bit, why do you think it's understudied? And I feel like people should do it more because they can go and have access to things.
Yes, no, they should. They definitely should. I mean, I think there are many reasons for this, let's say, lack of popularity compared to other places. And I'm gonna say, to start with, I mean, that's said, I mean, let's say that there are many levels. So let's start from the ancient one. I think there is it lacks. There is the lack of a big narrative. Again, Herodotus style, or Tacitus on the Germans, that that people have heard over and over, because even when they in school, before university, but also in the university, when they study Alexander, what sticks in mind, it's not for some reason, it's not in Central Asia, it's Egypt, it's Babylon, is when he goes to Troy, even though, I mean, he fought in Central Asia for 2 years, the 2 bloody years, and this is slowly dawning on people that actually he spent more time in Central Asia than anywhere else during the campaign. But for some reason, I would say there is the lack of a big narrative that portrays this place as central, the way other historians in the classical world, Xenophon, for the whole tour that he did of the western part of the empire, that already brings that into the focus of people's mind. And then on the modern side, said how it is, but that's a fact. Those areas where belonged to the other side of the Iron Curtain for a long time. And that means that scholarship on them was mainly not done in English, and there was just more difficult to go there. But it stays like that for 70 years, and that it makes more difficult to bring it into the scholarly discourse the same way, which then trickles down towards the public, the same way that has happened for Turkey, or again for Egypt, for Iran itself, and in the case specifically of Afghanistan, then you had the Soviet invasion, and then 40 plus years of basically uninterrupted war, and the place mostly for the Mujahideen, for the Talibans, and not for what the country is besides that, and was and still is. And then there is another issue, so I think somehow related to that, with again, are the languages that today people speak over there, because English is not the vehicular language over there. There is Russian, so you should know some Russian, just also to interact with people, also because it's easier to find a Russian course than an Uzbek one outside of Uzbekistan. But that becomes a problem if you go there and you don't speak the language, how to interact with people. And then also, again, I think that one thing that might be a problem, especially for somebody just new to the field, it's this, let's say, Soviet-style inheritance, how difficult it is somehow to get the permits to run excavations in those places. Somewhere more difficult than others. Turkmenistan, for example, is notoriously difficult. Uzbekistan is more easy access somehow, but still sometimes it can get very complicated. And so somehow you need to get networked. And so I mean, if you start putting all of them together, that gives you a sense of how and why it's not so mainstream. And also because that there are relatively few people doing this. So either you get into, let's say, a school of thought or an environment which does these things. Otherwise, starting from the outside, say you start working on Hellenistic Anatolia, and then you get interested in other things and say, yeah, I would like actually to see what's a little behind in there. Then maybe your advisor says, but I don't know anybody, and so that's, I think that these are some of the reasons of why it is yet not so popular. I think, like in Europe, for example, the only university I know of, I think it's the only one in Europe, who has a Central Asian department with Central Asian courses is in the Czech Republic. And, kudos to them, but it's one, and they do amazing research. They are really top notch. But, unfortunately, it's not in London, that Cambridge has a Central Asian program that makes it already more popular. It's sad. It says a lot about Europe, in many respects. But that's, I mean, it would be the same here. I think it's Harvard has a PhD program in Central Asian Studies. People would know it more than if it has it in any other university in the country.
Yeah, I mean, you're just talking about all the struggles that I feel like I often hear from scholars here who want to study anything outside of kind of the big ones, the norm. So certainly I understand these issues. So one thing that popped into my brain as you were talking was the language. So it's interesting. So you need Russian, but there obviously maybe Uzbek options. So, as someone who had to make the transition from classics proper, I would imagine that you started with ancient Greek and Latin, like many classicists do. So, transitioning away into something so far and so different, how did you manage that? And, did you have to learn a ton of new languages? Did you only have to learn one or two? And how did you handle that transition?
Well, badly, I fear. And I'm still in the process. It's difficult. I lacked and still lack a proper training in ancient Iranian languages. Which in a way, I'm. This is yet not such a big deal because dealing with the Achaemenid period, we have evidence from the archive, which is in Elamite. You have evidence from Aramaic texts, but yet not Bactrian, Sogdian, all the Middle Iranian languages. As I said, so somehow. And these sources in Elamite are getting, for example, from the tablets, they are getting translated by people who actually know their job very good and at quite a swift pace. So even if you can somehow get access while giving you a little breathing space to decide also which direction you want to do, and to decide to understand what level of proficiency you need to handle those sources, depending of what angle your research goes into. But that's definitely something that one has to take into account. The challenge that presented to me earliest was with modern languages, starting from Russian, because I thought that I had to get somehow acquainted with the literature, especially the archaeological one. And that's something that is still ongoing. I love Russian, but it's a very challenging language. But I think you need to. If I had to give myself an advice, years ago, would have been start early on, because and to really to get into the mindset that this is not an environment in which you can go English only, because it's just not. Sometimes people still publish in other languages. Then there are journals who with a different audience, and which now, of course, gets more and more anglicized, but still, there are groundworks which were written in Russian, and then some. So that's something that you cannot ignore. And I find it interesting, and good that it is like that, also because it gives you a sense of how the history of the place was. Vehicular languages before English were French and Russian. Why? Because of the story of the area, who had access there, which agreements were in place. And that's also, it's part of the scholarly work, the intellectual traditions that you have to deal with. So sometimes you happen to talk to people who were trained under the Soviet Union, and they might have different ways of looking at things, which are not, you're not here to say they are better or worse, but sometimes it's just a different mindset. And even now, 30 years after, there are now Chinese scholars or Japanese or Koreans or from East Asia addressing the same region from their own intellectual tradition. And sometimes, at conferences, you just see, that you have to find a common understanding on which questions you are asking, and from which perspective. And that's already very, very, very stimulating, because at least you are not, or as often happens, just a bunch of Europeans discussing things from their European standpoint. And that might also even help you as a European, or talking myself as an Italian, to develop a completely different understanding of certain issues that you never took into account because it's not in your mindset given your background. So also intellectually, it's a very fascinating field to be in, I would say.
As you were talking, again, sparking and hitting on all the right notes. So when it comes to conferences, and maybe conferences are on my mind just because I was at one 3 weeks ago, but obviously languages will shape kind of which school of thought you follow, and it'll shape kind of where the scholarship is. So for Bactria, does that get more wrapped into well, let me back up and say, are there any conferences that handle just kind of Bactria, that region itself? I would guess probably not because it's too small, but I will let you answer that. But also, if not, where does it fall? Does it tend to go more into sort of classics focused conferences, or because of the geographical area, would it go into sort of ancient Eastern conference? I don't know, who do more ancient Asia, not classic. So where would you say it goes?
Well, this is a good time to do advertisements. There was into this was a very big issue until not so long ago because the place did not have a proper field. And in 2016, Professor Rachel Mayers from the University of Reading launched the first ancient Hellenistic Central Asian Research Network conference, which was because she did her yeah, her book was published in 2014 and was a sort of first attempt at the cultural history of the region during the Hellenistic period. It's called the Hellenistic Far East. That's, by the way, a very good reference point, I would say, for anybody who is not as, also for specialists, of course, but they know it already, for laymen and women, so to say, who want to get a sense of the thing, because it's scientific, relies on data, reliable, but also very enjoyable and not too long. So that's a very interesting point. Entry point, and she kind of decided to bring together because she had a sense that there was interest in the topic, and she decided to bring together more established and coming up, running up scholars on the field. Just to give this platform to people, and the conferences have been going on ever since, and they span the whole breadth of the period, basically from the Achaemenids to the early Islamic invasion, I would say. So and it's there are also that conference in Berlin that I mentioned earlier. There were also people working on the Bronze Age. So you really it's a space for basically everyone working in the region from a transdisciplinary and, let's say, scalar perspective in time and also space, which I think has become the reference point for specialists in precisely in the region. But then, of course, you can try to sell yourself at other conferences working on more specifically on, say, the Hellenistic period, just to say, hey, there were also an Hellenistic kingdom in there. Or if you go to ancient Near Eastern conferences, you can say, well, actually, you can discuss how, let's say, concepts of universal rule developed by the Achaemenids based on the Assyrians, on the Elamites, and so forth, played out in there. And so you can bring in the topic in more, let's say, established, let's say, scholarly environments. But then now there is also one that specifically deals with the region. So that's it's a very recent development, but a welcome one, because it really gives a platform for people to get together in a way. And it has a Facebook group, which is a very active one, and which also, it's a sign of the time, how people manage to interact with each other besides more established venues to share research, to ask for literature, because sometimes this is also a problem. There are some journals which are not so easy to find, some older works which somebody may have access to, while other no. And that's a very good way of making use of modern technology.
Well, I'm very happy to hear about this. Very, very happy. So I'm curious, how does this new development now affect, or does it affect, let's say, how we might teach people in school about Bactria both before and after Alexander the Great. Are there enough resources now that we can do it without just sort of giving it a quick offhand mention, like, oh, this was a place, this was a thing, and now we move on? Or do we still have some a ways to go before we can really integrate and do it justice?
Well, I think both. The answer could be, you could answer both ways, because again, it's a narrative history of the region. It's at the moment continuously, from Cyrus to Qutaiba in the 8th century. It's impossible to write, because, for example, for the Kushans, which is this big empire, say between the 1st century BCE, 3rd century AD, you really lack the sources. You have narrative sources. You have the inscriptions, you have the coins, you have archaeological data, but it's very difficult to do something even remotely comparable to what we can do for the Roman Empire or even the Hellenistic kingdoms, of course. And for the Achaemenid period, it's quite the same. But you can, for example, do case studies, bringing together several sets of evidence and trying to get a sense of the general developments of the region and looking at it. I think that right now the best thing that can be done is looking at it in its Eurasian context, so not just zooming in on the place as itself, but to keep in mind, starting by reminding people that this was something that very early on gets mentioned in Mesopotamian sources from around the 3rd millennium before Christ. So that already that belonged to some extent, that how exactly, of course, that's a big issue, but it belonged to some extent into the horizon of the early civilization we make textbook start from, and so I think it's now we are in a better position to give a sense of how this place was central to the world that we discuss, including the Persian world, and not just this breakaway place that people somehow conquered but could never establish rule on. So this graveyard of empire idea, which is still out there. We have now, I think, can piecing together different sources and also reading differently some that we already know, Arian, for example, so the whole history of Alexander. There is the possibility, I think, to get a different sense of the region as something central to the history of, let's say, the wider Near East, and then subsequently of the Hellenistic kingdoms, as better than we were in the condition to do, I would say, even just 30 years ago.
Wow. I mean, it's fascinating. So just kind of a fun one. I mean, we talked about the 2004 Alexander, and we were talking, so much about this really interesting region and how there's all this new scholarship. And so one of the things I would like to know is, if you were put in charge of a great project that could bring more attention to this part of the world, what would you like to see done, and who would you, or what would you focus it on?
Well, I mean, there are so many things, but if I had to pick one, I would like to edit slash co-edit something like the world of Iron Age Central Asia. You know that Routledge World series. Because I'm saying this because in 2020, 2 volumes came out. The World of the in the same series, the World of the Oxus Civilization, which is an amazing overview of this Bronze Age period that I talked about, and then another one by Rachel Mears that we mentioned already, the Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek world, which focuses, as the name suggests, on the post-Alexander period. But as you see, something in between is lacking, which is the whole Iron Age thing, which basically goes 1500 BC to Alexander. And I think that this is something that it's a gap that should be filled. And it will be very, very interesting to do so, because I mean, you asked how would I pictured it. You could use a venue like that to provide some sort of reasoned overview of all the literary evidence, not just from the Greek period, but you get specialists from the Persepolis archive, for example, kind of giving us a sense, an overview with some particularly prominent examples of all the texts that mention the region, and we can decide where Central Asia actually begins and ends, because this is already a big problem. But you could say all the Persian satrapies in the east, Irkania, Parthia, Dramjana, Carmania, Bactria. So let's say from the Caspian Sea to Kabul, and then Samarkand, from Bandar Abbas to Samarkand, kind of give a very broad general understanding of what the Achaemenid Far East, including Central Asia, would be. Then you have all the Greek texts, and then you could, thinking of bringing in for the steppes, which is a crucial component, which too often gets forgotten. You could think of bringing a sinologist and listing the Chinese text of the same period that if they are, that talk about these places, these people, and their interaction with those regions, just to get a sense of how the steppe world was about around that time. And then you bring in the archaeological sources, and so you could really provide. The idea would be to provide a tool, a research tool, and also a teaching tool for people for this period, which, as you see, still lacks a coherent overview of something crucial, because it's in between the Bronze Age and what happens after Alexander. And even though, these two volumes didn't exist 4 years ago, and they are a huge achievement. And there is another one I know planned about the Kushans. So you see, it starts developing this, let's say, research toolkit, providing a long overview of the whole region from the Bronze Age to the Islamic conquest, but you still lack kind of the central pillar, so what's in between, which includes the Achaemenids. And I think that this is something which at some point should be tackle on, and it's so fascinating because I think it gives you the possibility to bring together so many people from different backgrounds and really kind of give back a sense of how multidisciplinary the research on this period and this area has to be, which is in turn mirrors how complex the social environment was. So that's where I would start from if I would be given, the resources and also the skills to coordinate, because also you need to coordinate the thing like this, which is not easy. But I would start from there.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I would hope that someone out there would let you do it. So typically at the end of each podcast episode, there are 2 questions that I like to leave both our audience and our guests with.
Interested in learning more about the wonders of ancient Persia? Visit the UCLA Archaeological Gazetteer of Iran. The Gazetteer digitally preserves famous locations, World Heritage sites, and lesser-known areas from all time periods of ancient Iranian history. You can explore using the interactive map, or visit the encyclopedic catalog for updates to the ever-growing list of archaeological sites. Visit www.irangazetteer.ucla.edu and learn more about what the Archaeological Gazetteer of Iran has to offer.
Without further ado, the first of these questions is, what do you believe is the greatest legacy left to us from ancient Persia?
Oh, well, it's a big question. I would say, as somebody before me in this podcast already mentioned, the achievement of establishing the first world empire, which means having made the world at the time smaller by connecting, not just with the roads and administration also, but not just that, but just with the sense of belonging to one place, so many different areas of the world, and establishing a template of rulership how to handle this diversity and this thing that empire is for generations and centuries and millennia afterwards to follow. And that was really a quantic leap in the history of Afro-Eurasia. And this is something that slowly it's starting to dawn on both specialists and the general public. But it's a game changer realization, I would say. Also because now that globalization studies are so on the rise, even in the ancient world, they usually start, or it's common to hear that, with the Hellenistic period, the world was brought together and cosmopolitanism began. And then at some point you look back and say, this already existed 200 years prior to that. And some of the thing that we look at as very new, kind of the Greek miracle and going down there, they were already there. And this is something that should not be overestimated. Also because it left a mark, it left a memory, even when people forgot who the Achaemenids were. But this way of doing the empire, they did it first in Afro-Eurasia. And that's something that deserves mention, I think.
Yeah, for sure. No, definitely left a huge impact. And the second question is, what do you think would be the best legacy that we can leave for future students of Iranian studies?
Ooh, well, that's another very difficult question. But maybe I would say starting to understand, like looking at Iran more as an idea than as a place or a people, even though there is an Iranian language family and there is something called Iran, but to think of the place in terms of, and the period also in terms of the idea of the world that they brought about. Because that, I think, it's a good way to take a step back from, let's say, ethnic categorization, Greeks and barbarians, East and West, but look for Iran in the material legacy. For example, the Greeks were so crazy about certain type of goblets which came from the empire. Or certain kinds of fashion, or certain ways to even to sit and to drink, and kind of from a cultural perspective, more than about people and power, but to try to approach Iran as a cultural legacy that encompassed the huge spans of the Afro-Eurasian world, and left a legacy that you find way beyond antiquity as a way of doing high culture, which I think it's a good way to think also transcultural, and not just looking for Iranians in Iranian things, there's something with a label, but in terms of ideas. And that would be, I think, a good starting point for looking at these legacies on a global scale, like people are trying to do for other periods and for other cultures.
Yeah. I mean, for sure, there's so many different things, so I don't think there's a right or a wrong answer there. But I wish I could ask a billion more questions, but time is always the enemy here. So I want to thank you though so much for coming on our show. I mean, it's been such a pleasure to learn more about a fascinating region that I really didn't know much about, and I do hope that in the future we can speak to you again.
I would love to. Thank you so much for having me, and so good luck with the next episodes. I'm looking forward for more legacies.
Legacies of Ancient Persia is a Portavood podcast production, hosted and edited by Lexi Henning, with select episodes co-hosted by Marissa Stevens. Cover art provided by Hadley Leesman and original music by Brent Arhart. Established in 2017 as the premier research center for the study of ancient Iran, the mission of the Purdue Institute for the Study of the Iranian World is to engage in transformative research on all aspects of Iranian antiquity, including its reception in the medieval and modern periods, by expanding on the traditional domains of old Iranian studies and promoting cross-cultural and interdisciplinary scholarship. Thanks for listening to our show. It's available to stream on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to follow us on social media at Purdue Institute and at Purdue UCLA, or visit our website, purdue.ucla.edu. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a 5-star rating and review us. For podcast inquiries or questions about the Purdue Institute, please email us at purduepodcastproduction@gmail.com. We'll see you next time as we continue our deep dive into the legacies of ancient Persia.